Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from a nod on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth and it was full of blueberry muffin mix. And it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix and he ended up choking to death. I did the autopsy of both the robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs, dissected everything, completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. Forensic pathologist here. Two come to mind. I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back I pulled the sheet back and already knew, he looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple, textbook stab and incised wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted quizzed by PD about "are you sure?" because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact, fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray or CT, of the upper chest/abdomen/pelvis. No bullet. At that point someone said, "Fuck it, let's scan the whole body." Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa, area behind the knee. It had embolized/traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. Not a doctor, but a whole-body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus, found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec, easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago, that the surgeons/medics left, and rather than perform risky surgery, the accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. My grandmother had a massive stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side, and died in her 60s from a heart attack, but while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer, but she never had any pain from it because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker, so it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in, but we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead, and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, They found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head, the entry wound was obscured by his hair, and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. My wife is a pathologist assistant and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point, now has no interest. I'm going to count myself lucky I was only scalped when I was born. The doctor was furious at my mother for inconveniently going into labor an hour before the scheduled end of his shift and the golf game he had scheduled an hour later. He rushed the whole thing, doing a lot of damage to my mum in the process. He cut too far, grabbed my head with metal forceps and pulled so hard and abruptly that his grip slipped and he pulled all the skin off the top of my head. 40+ years later and I still have scars on my scalp that makes hairdressers recoil in horror. Sheep farmer, I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggled to breathe but antibiotics, steroids and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away and I cut her open to see what the hell happened fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with shit. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life and it didn't kill her until she was 2. I may be late to the party but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit. Morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tank mates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old, they were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly and a million thanks aren't enough. I have more stories if anyone is curious. Edit. I should add that her granddaughter made a point of saying this lady did not hold a grudge on her brother, and they lived full lives on happy terms. Masters in Forensic Pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown-out skull but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck and into the chest. That was pretty wild. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless, based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The penis was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. Edit. I remembered another one. In my final year of training we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques, for example difficult intubation, cricothyroidotomy, etc. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't pass. I think she has some kind of growth or mass in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It of course had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of death identified. Not mine but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night. To many people during the day, one time it was really late. Around 2 a.m. he was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move/twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. Not an autopsy doctor, but did take anatomy and physiology too with lab in college. The lab was working on cadavers being prosected by more advanced students. A prosection is the dissection of a cadaver, human or animal, or part of a cadaver by an experienced anatomist in order to demonstrate for students anatomic structure. Anyway, one of the cadavers, we had a male and a female for obvious reasons, was a big ol' linebacker-looking dude. Like, and older bodybuilder type. His age at time of death was late 50s. His heart has been removed by the anatomist, and we were examining it because it was very enlarged and contributed to his death. We all had to hold it in our hands to feel the heft, like size and weight, and compare it to the heft of the female's heart, which was normal-sized, about like a large apple. The male's heart, for comparison, was the size of a small cantaloupe. I went first, for whatever reason, and the instructor lifted the enlarged heart out of its preservative bath and placed it in my hands. I damn near dropped the thing when it shocked me with what felt like a jolt of electricity. I, understandably, I think, made a startled noise, and the instructor took the heart back before I could juggle it onto the floor. "Oh," she said. "I forgot to warn you, look out for the pacemaker." Apparently when someone has a pacemaker there's a battery too and they don't bother taking it out/off. They just snip the leads and leave it there, so if you touch both bare leads you get a mild shock, even through your exam gloves. That was a mildly disturbing experience. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe for head trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden the person was a crime scene and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. Please, like this video and comment your thoughts. If you like this channel, please, subscribe for more Reddit content you can listen on a go.